The glass shattered against my face. A gloved hand reached through the broken window, grabbed my hair. I kicked the door into his chest and snatched the burner phone he dropped. Now I'm holding it in the Vance mansion, staring at Eleanor's secret contacts. And the woman across the table is wearing my husband's dead wife's wedding ring, the one buried with her. The same face, the same voice, the same ring. But she's smiling at me, like I'm the ghost. Rain lashed the windshield of the SUV, turning the Pennsylvania asphalt into a shimmering black ribbon that snaked through the dense woods of Westchester. Sarah Miller gripped the leather armrest, her knuckles white against the tan upholstery. Every time the tires hit a puddle, the vehicle hydroplaned slightly, a sickening slide that she felt in the small of her back. Beside her, Julian's hands remained rigid on the steering wheel, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line that appeared whenever they neared his mother's estate. She didn't need to see his eyes to sense the simmering frustration. The air in the cabin was thick, smelling of expensive leather and the ozone of the storm. "Your mother doesn't suggest things, Julian. She dictates them," Sarah said, her voice brittle, echoing in the cramped space. "She's weaving a net around our lives, and you're handing her the twine. This dinner isn't about a family reunion. It's about her reclaiming her favorite toy." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor wants stability for the kids, Sarah. Is that a crime?" She offered to fund the new wing of the clinic. "She's trying." "It's a leash," Sarah snapped, the rhythmic clink-clink of the iron bolt in her pocket punctuating her words. She rolled the rusted metal between her thumb and forefinger, the rough texture a grounding force. "She doesn't give gifts. She buys collateral. Look at the way you're driving. You're terrified of being 5 minutes late to her table." A sudden, metallic roar drowned out Julian's retort. Sarah's internal sensor for structural integrity screamed, the sound of a high-performance engine redlining far too close. A black sedan surged from the blind spot behind a curtain of rain, its headlights blurred into predatory yellow slits. It slammed into their rear quarter panel with a bone-jarring thud. The impact jerked Sarah's head against the window, a dull vibration shuddering through her skull. Metal shrieked against metal, the sound of a saw blade hitting a nail. The sedan didn't pull away. It lunged again, a deliberate, heavy shove. The SUV's tail end kicked out. Sarah felt the center of gravity shift, the weight of the vehicle betraying them as they hit the muddy shoulder. The world tilted. Gravity dissolved into a chaotic swirl of splintering glass and the acrid scent of scorched rubber. The SUV plummeted down the embankment, tumbling through brush and soil, a heavy, rhythmic thumping of the chassis hitting the earth until it settled into a groaning, inverted wreck at the bottom of the ravine. Silence descended, heavy and thick, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the smell of raw gasoline. Sarah blinked away the haze, her lungs burning from the dust of the deployed airbags. She tasted copper, blood from a bitten lip. Outside the shattered window, boots crunched on dry leaves and wet gravel. A masked figure, dressed in dark tactical gear that blurred into the shadows of the pines, reached for the door handle. Adrenaline surged, sharp and cold, clearing the fog in her brain. Sarah didn't scream. She calculated. She coiled her legs against the dashboard and the seat, waiting until the gloved hand gripped the frame. With every ounce of strength in her quads, she shoved the door. The heavy metal frame caught the assailant square in the chest, throwing them backward into the muck. A small, dark object skittered across the dirt, reflecting the dim light of the overhead moon. Sarah lunged through the broken glass of the window, ignoring the shards that bit into her palms. Her fingers scraped the cold earth, searching until they closed around a plastic casing. A burner phone. The stranger scrambled upright, gasping for air, and locked eyes with her through the mesh of a balaclava. Before Sarah could move again, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness of the trees. The sound of their retreat swallowed by the downpour. Julian groaned beside her, struggling with his seatbelt. Sarah shoved the phone deep into her pocket, the hard edges resting against her iron bolt. "Julian, are you hit?" she demanded, her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. He shook his head dizzily, his eyes unfocused. She ignored the ache in her shoulder and began to climb out of the wreckage, her mind already measuring the distance back to the road. They reached the crest of the hill just as the rain began to taper off into a misty drizzle. The Vance estate loomed in the distance, a Gothic silhouette of stone and iron. Sarah leaned against a tree, her breathing ragged. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket, the screen glowing with a harsh, clinical blue light that seemed out of place in the ancient woods. Her thumb swiped the screen. There were no passwords, no locks, just a list of recent calls. Her heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. The most recent outgoing call, placed only 10 minutes ago, was to a contact labeled E. Sarah's stomach turned. She knew that number. She had seen it on Julian's caller ID 1,000 times. It was Eleanor's private line. A string of text messages sat beneath the call log. Target in sight. Proceeding to intercept. The reply from E was short and chilling. Ensure the delay is sufficient. No permanent damage to the asset. Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. The accident hadn't been a random act of road rage or a botched robbery. It was a scheduled event, a calculated move to rattle her, to put her on the defensive before she even stepped foot inside the house. She looked at Julian, who was dusting off his suit jacket with trembling hands, his face a mask of shock. "She tried to kill us," Sarah whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah," Julian stammered, though he wouldn't look at the phone. "It was a carjacking. This neighborhood, it's changing. The weather is changing." He repeated the phrase under his breath, a rhythmic mantra that made Sarah's skin crawl. "The weather isn't changing, Julian. Your mother is," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. She tucked the phone away. She wouldn't show him yet. If she showed him now, he'd find a way to rationalize it, to build a wall of excuses around Eleanor's malice. She needed more. She needed to see the trap before she could spring it. The massive oak doors of the Vance mansion swung open before they could even reach for the heavy brass knocker. The foyer was a cavern of white marble and gold leaf, the air smelling of lilies, a scent so cloying it felt like a physical weight in the lungs. Eleanor stood at the base of the grand staircase, her silk suit the color of a bruised plum, her hair pulled back with surgical precision. "My darlings," Eleanor exclaimed, her voice a practiced melody of concern. "We heard the sirens. We were so worried. Robert said there was an incident on the lower road." "We were run off the road, Mother," Julian said, stepping into the light. He looked diminished, his shoulders slumped. Eleanor's gaze flicked to Sarah, lingering on the mud on her boots and the blood on her lip. There was a flicker of something in those cold, gray eyes. Not sympathy, but an assessment. Like a foreman checking the tolerances on a beam she intended to break. How dreadful. But you're here now. Wash up quickly. We have a guest who has been very patient. Sarah followed them into the dining room, her hand hovering near her pocket, the clink of the bolt a warning in the silence. The table was set for 4, the silver service gleaming under a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion. Standing by the fireplace was a woman in a white lace dress. As the woman turned, Sarah felt the floor beneath her boots turn to sand. The woman's face was a perfect, haunting replica of Rebecca, Julian's first wife. The same high cheekbones, the same slight, knowing smile that Sarah had seen in the portraits upstairs. But it was the hand resting on the mantel that stopped Sarah's heart. On the woman's ring finger sat a distinctive diamond wedding ring, a custom setting of interlocking platinum vines that Sarah knew had been buried with Rebecca 3 years ago. "Sarah, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as oil. "I'd like you to meet Elena Thorne. She's a distant cousin of the Maryland branch. Doesn't she look remarkably like family?" The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her movements precise, her silver spoon clinking against the porcelain with a rhythmic, nerve-shredding regularity. She spoke of legacy, of the purity of the Vance bloodline, and the necessity of ensuring the estate remained in capable hands. "I've spent the afternoon with my attorneys," Eleanor said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "The current structure of the will is outdated. It doesn't account for the volatility of modern marriages. I intend to rewrite the primary trust to favor the direct line. Stability, Sarah. Surely a builder like you understands the importance of a solid foundation." Sarah felt the air leave the room. Eleanor wasn't just threatening her status, she was announcing her erasure. She looked at Julian, desperate for a sign of resistance. But he was gone. He sat staring at Elena Thorne, his eyes dilated and glazed. Every time Elena spoke, her voice a soft, questioning lilt. Julian leaned in, his breathing shallow. "The ring is beautiful, isn't it?" Elena asked, noticing Sarah's gaze. She held her hand up, the diamonds catching the light. "It's an heirloom." Eleanor felt it was a waste to leave such beauty in the dark. "That ring was buried with Rebecca," Sarah said, her voice a low growl. "I watched them close the casket, Elena. Or whoever you are." Julian snapped his head toward Sarah, his expression sharp with a sudden, drug-like intensity. "Sarah, please, don't be hysterical. It's a family piece. Mother has several versions of the setting. You're making Elena uncomfortable." "I'm making her uncomfortable?" Sarah stood up, the chairs screeching against the marble floor. "Julian, look at her. She's wearing your dead wife's face and her jewelry, and you're acting like we're at a Sunday brunch." Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted the angle of her wine glass by a fraction of an inch. "You've had a traumatic evening, Sarah. The accident has clearly affected your nerves. Perhaps a quiet night in the guest wing is what you need. Julian, dear, help Elena to the conservatory. I think she'd like to see the orchids." Julian rose like a marionette, offering his arm to the ghost in the white dress. He didn't look back at Sarah. He didn't even acknowledge she was in the room. As they disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, Eleanor turned to Sarah, a thin, predatory smile stretching her lips. "The foundation is shifting, Sarah. I'd be careful where I stepped if I were you." Sarah fled the dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed air, but the house felt like it was shrinking, the walls of mahogany and velvet pressing inward. She climbed the stairs to the guest wing, her boots thudding heavily on the thick carpet. When she reached her door, she stopped. The scent of lilies was no longer a faint background note. It was a wall of perfume, thick and cloying, as if 100 funeral wreaths had been stuffed into the vents. She pushed the door open and froze. Her wedding portrait, a large canvas that had been moved from their city apartment at Eleanor's request, hung over the bed. It had been systematically destroyed. Long, jagged rents crisscrossed the fabric, focusing entirely on Sarah's face. The canvas hung in ribbons, the white wall behind it looking like bone showing through a wound. On the nightstand sat a single vase of lilies, their white petals bruised and brown at the edges. Sarah walked to the window, her hands shaking. She could see the gardener, Robert Hudson, moving through the moonlit garden below. He was carrying a heavy shovel, his massive frame hunched as he moved toward the cellar entrance. She realized then that she wasn't just being insulted. She was being hunted. The accident, the actress, the slashed portrait, they were all layers of a single structure designed to collapse on top of her. Sarah didn't stay in the room. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the mantel, a solid weight that felt like a weapon, and slipped back into the hallway. She needed to find the truth before Eleanor could finish whatever she had started. The library was a canyon of leather-bound books and shadows, the air smelling of dust and old cigar smoke. Sarah moved through the stacks, her footsteps silenced by the heavy rugs. She reached the far corner, where the Vance family records were kept. But a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, the brass bookend raised. Robert Hudson stood in the doorway, his neck scarred by a jagged chemical burn, his eyes fixed on her with a dull, murderous intent. He didn't say a word. He simply began to walk toward her, his massive hands opening and closing. "Stay back, Robert," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. 1, 2, 3, Robert muttered, his voice a low, rhythmic drone. He lunged, his weight throwing Sarah back against a shelf. Books tumbled around them, the heavy volumes hitting the floor like stones. Sarah twisted, using her center of gravity to slip under his arm, and swung the bookend. The brass caught him on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Robert staggered, his eyes rolling back as he slumped against the mahogany desk. He hit the floor hard, unconscious before he even stopped moving. Sarah gasped for air, her lungs burning. She didn't waste time. She knelt beside him and began to go through his pockets. Her fingers found a heavy, gold-plated watch, far too expensive for a gardener, and a small, clear glass vial filled with a colorless liquid. She pulled out the burner phone again, comparing the numbers. Then she saw it. A message to Robert from E, sent 20 minutes ago. "The purse is in the foyer. Plant the vial now. The police will be here by midnight." Sarah's blood ran cold. The plan wasn't just to replace her, it was to frame her. Eleanor was going to poison herself, or perhaps Elena, and the evidence would be found in Sarah's bag. She turned her attention back to the burner phone, scrolling deeper into the deleted messages. She found a series of transfers to a bank account in New York. The recipient wasn't Elena Thorne. The name on the account was Chloe Smith, an actress. Sarah whispered. "You're just an actress." She heard a soft sound from the hallway, the swish of silk against the floor. Sarah stood up, pocketing the vial and the phone. She had the blueprints now. It was time to see if the structure could be brought down. Sarah found Chloe in the powder room, the actress staring at herself in the infinite loop of the opposing mirrors. The Elena mask had slipped. Her shoulders were hunched, and she was frantically rubbing at a smudge of lipstick on her chin. "How much is she paying you, Chloe?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing in the small, tiled space. Chloe spun around, her eyes wide with a very real terror. I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Elena." "Your name is Chloe Smith. You have a sister in a hospital in Queens with a medical bill that looks like a phone number," Sarah said, stepping into the room. She held up the burner phone. "I have the wire transfers. I have the messages. And I have the gardener unconscious in the library." Chloe's knees buckled. She sank onto the edge of the marble vanity, her white dress billowing around her. She said it was just a role, a psychological study. She said Julian needed to move on, and I was the only way to help him. She's drugging him, Chloe, and she's going to frame me for murder. Do you think she'll let you walk away once the police arrive? You're the only witness to the fraud. Chloe began to shake, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She told me the ring was a replica. She said everything was controlled. Nothing is controlled with Eleanor, Sarah said, reaching out to grab Chloe's arm. You're going to come with me. You're going to tell the police exactly what happened. The door to the powder room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Eleanor Vance stood in the threshold, a small silver pistol held in her gloved hand. The weapon looked like a toy, but the barrel was pointed directly at Sarah's chest. I'm afraid Chloe won't be going anywhere, Eleanor said, her voice a low, soothing purr. And neither will you, Sarah. You've been such a disruptive influence on my son. It's really for the best that we conclude this tonight. Eleanor moved with a cold, surgical precision, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. The silver pistol was steady, a heavy weight in her small hand. Move into the study, Sarah. Chloe, go to your room and stay there. If you breathe a word of this, your sister's experimental treatment ends tonight. Do you understand? Chloe nodded frantically, her face a mask of tears, and scrambled out of the room. Sarah felt the cold bite of the gun's barrel against her ribs as Eleanor shoved her toward the back of the house. The study was a tomb of dark mahogany and stale cigar smoke. Julian was there, slumped in a wingback chair by the dead fireplace. His eyes were open but vacant, his head lolling to one side. On the desk lay a stack of legal documents, their pages crisp and white against the dark blotter. Look at him, Sarah, Eleanor whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. He's finally at peace. No more arguments. No more stress fractures. He's signed everything. The estate, the guardianship, the medical directives. He's going to a very exclusive facility in the morning, a place where he can be looked after. Sarah looked at the documents. Julian's signature was a shaky, unrecognizable scrawl at the bottom of a voluntary commitment form. You've been drugging his wine, Sarah said, her voice thick with disgust. Every night. That's why he couldn't see what was happening. It's for his own protection, Eleanor said, her voice rising with a touch of fanaticism. He's weak, just like his father. He needs a firm hand to guide him. And you were the rot in the foundation. I had to cut you out. Eleanor stepped back, a cold smile playing on her lips. I've already called the police, Sarah. I told them you attacked poor Robert in the library. I told them you stole the family ring. When they arrive, they'll find you here, holding the gun you used to threaten me. A desperate woman, losing her grip, trying to extort the family she ruined. Subverted. Sarah felt a cold, calculated calm settle over her. This was the moment. She had prepared for this. For months, ever since she noticed the first stress fracture in Julian's behavior, she had been building her own defense. She reached into her pocket, not for the iron bolt, but for her own smartphone. I called them too, Eleanor, Sarah said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. 10 minutes ago, from the library. I used the gardener's phone to send a GPS ping and a distress signal to the local precinct. I've been recording everything since I entered this room. Every word you just said about the drugs, the fraud, and the sanitarium. It's all on a cloud server now. You didn't just walk into a trap. You built it for yourself. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had outplayed the matriarch. She had been the smart one, the one who saw the structural flaws and reinforced them. She watched Eleanor's face for the flicker of fear, the moment of collapse. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she let out a soft, tittering laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Oh, Sarah, you really are a foreman, aren't you? Always so focused on the visible beams. You never think to look at the wiring behind the walls." The triumph in Sarah's chest turned to a cold, leaden weight. "What are you talking about?" "The police you called," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with pity. "Did you check the frequency? Did you look at the routing of that emergency signal? This estate has its own private cellular repeater, dear. Every signal that leaves this house passes through a filter I own. Your recording didn't go to a cloud server. It went to a local drive in my desk. And the officers who are arriving, they aren't the state police." Sarah's hand trembled. She looked at her phone. The signal bars were full. But a small red icon she hadn't noticed before was blinking, a symbol of a restricted, monitored network. "The chief of police in this town was my husband's college roommate," Eleanor continued, stepping closer, the pistol glinting. "His mortgage is paid by a Vance trust. When he gets here, he's not going to find a recording. He's going to find a woman who assaulted a staff member, stole a priceless heirloom, and then broke into a private study to harass her drugged husband. Your evidence is just more proof of your instability. You didn't save yourself, Sarah. You just gave me the rope I needed to hang you." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the rhythmic, soaring tone of a standard police cruiser, but a lower, more authoritative growl. The world tilted again. Sarah looked at Julian, who was still lost in his chemical fog, and realized she had never been more alone. Her smart play hadn't just failed. It had handed Eleanor the final piece of the puzzle. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice turning sharp as a razor. "Drop the phone. The performance is about to begin." The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights beginning to pulse against the heavy drapes of the study. Eleanor's face transformed in an instant. The cold, calculating mask dissolved into one of sheer, trembling terror. She shoved the silver pistol into Sarah's hand, her fingers surprisingly strong as she forced Sarah's grip around the cold metal. "Help! Someone help me!" Eleanor screamed, her voice a piercing shriek that echoed through the house. She stumbled backward, knocking over a heavy floor lamp, the bulb shattering with a sharp pop. "She's going to kill us. Julian, wake up. She has a gun." Sarah stood frozen, the heavy weight of the pistol in her hand feeling like a brand. She could hear the heavy thud of boots on the front porch, the sound of the oak doors being kicked open. "Drop the weapon," a voice boomed from the hallway. Sarah didn't look at the door. She looked at the wall behind the mahogany shelving. As a foreman, she had spent hours studying the historical blueprints of the Vance estate when they first moved in, looking for structural weaknesses. She remembered a detail, a service panel used by the Victorian-era staff to move between the study and the kitchens without being seen. She lunged for the hidden latch behind the third shelf of encyclopedias. Her fingers found the recessed lever, and with a groan of ungreased hinges, a section of the wall swung inward. "Julian, move!" Sarah grabbed her husband by the collar of his jacket, hauling him out of the chair. He was a dead weight, his feet dragging on the carpet. But the adrenaline gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She shoved him into the narrow, dusty dark of the crawl space, just as the study door burst open. "Police, don't move." Sarah pulled the panel shut behind her, the click of the latch swallowed by the roar of the officers entering the room. The crawl space was a claustrophobic tunnel of raw timber and cobwebs, the air smelling of ancient dust and dry rot. Sarah could hear the muffled shouts of the police in the study, their flashlights casting thin slivers of light through the cracks in the wood. "Where are they?" a voice demanded, Eleanor now sounding perfectly composed. "They went through the wall. There's a passage." Sarah didn't wait. She shouldered Julian's weight, her boots finding the narrow joists of the internal framing. "Keep your feet on the beams, Julian," she whispered into his ear, her voice a low, rhythmic command. "Don't look down. Just follow the sound of my breath." Julian let out a low, whimpering sound, but he began to move, his hands clutching Sarah's shoulders. They moved through the skeleton of the house, the rhythmic thud-thud of their movements echoing in the hollow spaces. Sarah felt the familiar geometry of the building in her mind. The load-bearing walls, the plumbing stacks, the electrical conduits. She wasn't a victim here. She was the architect of their escape. They reached the kitchen pantry, the smell of herbs and cold stone, a relief after the dust of the walls. Sarah pushed open the small service door and stepped out into the darkened kitchen. The house was a hive of activity, flashlights sweeping the grounds outside, but the dining room was empty. She saw the estate's integrated sound system panel on the wall, a high-end interface that Eleanor used to play classical music during her dinner parties. Sarah pulled the burner phone from her pocket and plugged it into the auxiliary port. "What are you doing?" Julian whispered, his eyes finally starting to clear as the drugs began to lose their grip. "I'm changing the playlist," Sarah said. She hit play on the recording she had made in the library, not the one in the study that Eleanor had intercepted, but the one from the burner phone, which had been recording the gardener's confession and the sounds of the struggle. The house was suddenly filled with the booming, distorted voice of Robert Hudson. 1, 2, 3. Eleanor said, "The purse is in the foyer. Plant the vial now. The police will be here by midnight." Then, Sarah's own voice, clear and sharp. "How much is she paying you, Chloe? I have the wire transfers. I have the messages." And finally, the most damning sound of all, the recording of Eleanor in the powder room, her voice cold and unmistakable. "If you breathe a word of this, your sister's experimental treatment ends tonight." The recording looped, the sound echoing off the marble floors and the gold leaf ceilings. Sarah stood in the center of the dining room, her hand resting on Julian's arm, as the police, the real state police, who had arrived in response to the massive security breach triggered by the sound system, swarmed into the room. Eleanor was standing in the foyer, her face a mask of frozen horror as her own voice betrayed her to the room full of officers. The chief of police, the man Eleanor had claimed to own, looked at her with a mixture of shock and disgust. The filter she had built hadn't accounted for a physical connection to the house's internal speakers. "Eleanor Vance," the chief said, his voice heavy. "I think you'd better come with us." The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the lawn of the Vance estate. The rain had washed the air clean, and the smell of wet earth and pine had replaced the cloying scent of lilies. Sarah and Julian stood on the porch, watching as the police cruisers pulled away, the blue lights fading into the dawn. Eleanor sat in the back of the lead car, her silhouette rigid and small behind the glass. Chloe Smith stood nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but resolute. She had given her statement, a full confession that would ensure Eleanor never set foot in this house again. Julian looked at the massive stone structure behind them, the house that had been his prison and his legacy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, the key to the front door. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the tall grass of the meadow. "The weather is changing," he said. and for the first time, the words didn't sound like a mantra of fear. They sounded like a fact. Sarah felt the iron bolt in her pocket, the rusted metal warm against her palm. She took it out and looked at it, then reached over and took Julian's hand. His grip was steady, the tremors gone. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice grounded and sure. "The foundation here is beyond repair. We'll build something else. Something with better bones." They walked down the driveway, past the shattered stone pillar and the scarred earth where the SUV had fallen. They didn't look back at the mansion. They just kept walking toward the road, two people moving through the light of a new day, leaving the ghosts of the Vances to rot in the shadows of the trees.